all for coming to our first local author festival. My name is Daniel Barber. I'm the programming and marketing librarian here in Burlington. And I've been looking forward to this event since actually last May when I started getting everybody together for it. We put out a call over the summer, and our turnout from the interest of this from authors, we had to turn away quite a few authors just because we just didn't have any more space. If you've been on both levels of the building so far, you realize where we put everybody. It's not traditional meeting spaces or event spaces. We found if we put a table there, we're going to have some more authors because we love supporting local authors. If you haven't been upstairs yet, if you haven't met the people on the perimeters yet, after the presentation, please make sure you do that. We are so happy. This event would not be happening if these authors didn't decide to join us today. So I have a few other people to thank. Our authors, let's give them a hand. The Friends of the Library in back for doing snack stands today. And BCAT. Thanks BCAT for coming to cover the event and doing such thoughtful interviews. And thank you to all of you who came out to support all of the wonderful creativity and talent that we have on both levels of the building. So again, this event runs until 4:30. So after the talk, make sure you buy your books from Ted, get your autographs, and then go upstairs, say hi to them again. They'll probably miss you because it'll be a quiet hour for them. But we want to make sure all these authors leave and feel supported by this wonderful community. And now to our guest of honor. Since 1995, Ted Reinstein has been a reporter for Boston WCVB's celebrated Chronicle, the nation's longest-running, locally produced nightly news magazine. He has been a contributing member of the WCVB editorial board since 2010. His first book, New England Notebook, One Reporter, 6 States, Uncommon Stories, was selected by National Geographic Traveler as one of its best picks. His most latest release, Travels Through the Heart and Soul of New England, just came out this past summer. Our book club did it as one of our selections. And we are so excited to welcome this Winthrop native to our meeting room once again. Please help me welcome Ted Reinstein.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you. And even though we just went through a round of thank yous, first of all, thank you very much to the Burlington Public Library for doing this entire event today to draw attention to local authors. But let me tell you, I know that my local authors in here and throughout the building would agree. You know, it can be a very lonely experience, right? It really can. You are pretty much left to yourself for a long period of time. You go through periods where you think this is just a pile of crap and no one's ever going to be interested in reading this. You have to psych yourself up that you are doing something that is worth doing. Am I right so far?
Amen.
Right. And yet you come up with something that often is more than just worth doing. It really adds to the knowledge of the world. And it doesn't matter whether that is science fiction or history or it doesn't matter. It all adds to everything that makes humanity worth being a part of. So, on that note, a round for all the authors here. So, as Daniel said, I'm going to talk to you for the next 45, 50 minutes maybe about my fifth book, my newest book, which is all about, well, really a labor of love. It's something I thought I might get to maybe when I was done reporting around New England, but the opportunity to do it came up and I grabbed it because this is a book that is about friends of mine. It is about friends of mine. It is about friends of mine whose stories so impacted me as people, so impacted me that without exception, everybody I'm going to share with you today, everybody whose story I'll share with you today are people that I stayed in touch with from our first meeting over doing a story about them, whatever that was. And they are people who I have stayed in touch with. They are people in many cases who have become close friends of mine. At the very least, though, people who I have stayed in touch with in some cases for 20, 25 years. So in those 25, now going more toward 30 years, I have been traveling around New England all that time, every corner of New England. And the difference between these stories and many of the stories we often see on Chronicle, if you ever watch, is that these are not about a particular place, right? They are all, obviously, in places all around New England. But these are about the most memorable people that I've met in all my travels. They're the most memorable people that I've met, and I'm going to share with you 3 stories each for the book. The full title is Stories of Resilience, Struggle, Resilience, and Triumph. So I'm going to share with you a few examples of each of those kind of topics. And then in between, as I do in the book, I'm going to share with you a story of another great friend of mine, the Great New England Diner. How many of you like diners? I realize I should say how many of you don't like diners, because then I could ask you to leave. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But you know, there's a reason why I have this great affection for diners. And it's not limited to diners. The reason why I have an affection for diners has nothing to do with food. Okay? You can get an Eggs Benedict at a lot of different places, although I don't actually eat Eggs Benedict, but you could get an omelet, you could get home fries at many different places. The difference between any other place and a diner. I always say diners are the most democratic, small d, right, of all eating places. The reason being, everybody goes to a diner. Everybody goes to a diner. I've sat at counters in diners from Maine to Rhode Island, and I have ended up sitting at a counter next to stockbrokers, steel workers, pipe fitters, teachers, you name it. That's the wonderful thing about diners. They're also usually a real key, integral part of the fabric of their community. And that's also what makes them different, because diners are what we call third places. You know what a third place is, right? We're in one right now. We're in a community gathering room for the Burlington Public Library. Third places in American life are the most valuable places of all, right? Because they are places where communities gather. They are not work, they are not home, they are that elusive third place. And it's not just a diner, it's not just a library. General stores, another huge thing for me in my stories. General stores, also third places, right? These are the places that make communities worth living in. These are places where communities gather. That's what attracts me to them. Rail trails are like that, another community gathering place that I have great affection for. So all of these people in their way kind of play into that. So let's jump in. So in terms of struggle, sometimes that struggle, I'm just going to move that cursor. Sometimes, you know, it ends up in funny places. You leave a cursor like that up and you've got a big, huge picture of somebody's face and suddenly it's sticking up their nose. So it's good to get rid of it now. You know, sometimes the struggle is preserving part of what makes your community unique and beloved to your community. And, you know, it's very often, we didn't today, but I'm sure many of you have had the experience where if you've been at an event at a public institution where you will begin with a land grant. That's become very popular to do these days. It's always made sense for some, it's become more of a thing that's more common today to acknowledge that wherever we are, because I always say, you know, you can make a general land grant about every square inch of America. It's all been Native American land. But you know, in Plymouth, about 5-6 years ago, I did a story that was more rare than a land acknowledgement, because this is that even more rare thing, which is a land return. Okay? So the Herring Pond tribe in Plymouth is part of the larger Wampanoag tribe, which is part of the larger Massachusetts nation. And the Herring Pond at one time, meaning 200 years ago, was in control of over 2,000 acres across Plymouth, which of course is the state's largest town of all. And that had shrunk to barely 1.5 acres, mostly for their little meeting house, within the last 200 years, maybe less, right? But the tribe had never given up on the hope of, at the very least, being able to somehow bring back and control a tribal cemetery that they knew was there. They knew was there. It had been at one point part of a high school, then it was part of a real estate development, residential development, and they never gave up hope. They never gave up the struggle of somehow being able to at least get that back in control, because it had been completely overgrown. I mean, people were able to find where it was. They could dig down beneath the dirt and move some of the brush aside and find 200-300-year-old gravestones, but they didn't control the land anymore. And to its great credit, the town of Plymouth in 2018 ceded back 6.5 acres of land, which took some doing. As I say, at that point it was private property, part of a residential development, but they were able to cede this 6.5 acres back to the Herring Pond tribe, and I spent an amazing day with them as they uncovered some of the very first stones that had not seen the light of air and day for, in some cases, 250 years. So there, the struggle was about kind of preserving some of their heritage, some of their own community, and they've succeeded despite the struggle. You know, sometimes the struggle is about retaining an entire way of life, seeing if you can preserve it against all odds, and at the same time, watching it slip away. In this case, slip below the water, below the waves. Because that's what's happening to the New England fishery. It's definitely what's happening in Gloucester. New Bedford, for instance, is a different story. I wouldn't say that it slipped away at all. It's still one of America's most prosperous ports, but not Gloucester. There are many reasons for it, which I won't get into. Gloucester has been caught between the crosshairs of a number of other social factors, which have absolutely made it, on top of the rules and regulations that have crushed the fishery, made it very difficult for a new and succeeding 2 generations now to go into fishing, but nonetheless, it's vanishing. It's vanishing. It's not vanishing entirely, and the fishing that remains in Gloucester is largely corporate fishing. In other words, you know, look, you have big pharma, right? You have big ag, big agriculture. There's big fishing. There's big fishing, and that's what survives. Just like most small family farms, right, have been pushed out by big farm, big agri, right? That's what's happened in Gloucester anyway with fishing. It's 2/3 of the case in New Bedford too. But again, it's a little bit more poignant in Gloucester because Gloucester had a much longer history of family fishing, the opposite of big fishing, right? The opposite. Long tradition. It was estimated that in 1900, there were over 2,500 family-owned fishing boats in Gloucester. Doesn't mean that 2,500 were on the water at any given time, but it means that there were 2,500 boats that were owned by families, often handed down from generation to generation. By 1970, that was down to 1,200. By last year, 2023, it was down to 71. Wow. So it is literally vanishing. There will still be fishing in Gloucester, but there may not be family fishing. And you know what that means to people like Joe Sanfilippo? It means that, as he puts it, the pipeline of fishing knowledge will be severed. That's how he learned to fish. That's how all family fishing was done, right? The knowledge of fishing, that pipeline was fed by succeeding families, by succeeding generations. Joe Sanfilippo learned to fish when he was 13 years old from his older brother Ricky. His older brother Ricky learned to fish from his dad, their dad. Their dad learned to fish from his dad, their grandfather. Their grandfather learned to fish from his dad, their great-grandfather. If family fishing disappears entirely, who's going to teach people how to fish? That's not what corporate fishing does. Okay? They're ready to put money together in investment on people who can readily use the boat and go out and fish. But if you have to teach people how to fish, that's not part of the business model, okay, of big fishing. So if family fishing goes away entirely, Joe Sanfilippo's point is, who's going to teach people how to fish? So he has done something that, as far as I know, is fairly unique. And it may be unique in all of the United States, I don't know. It's certainly unique in the Northeast. He has started what I describe as night school for fishing, right? So he has a school, and he teaches people who are interested in getting into fishing. This doesn't mean these people have a boat. These people may not be fishing ever. They're certainly not going to fish right away. But the point is, if the rules and regs ever relax enough, if the fishery ever comes back enough so that the bar comes down, on what it requires, what's needed to go out and fish. Right now, it's crushing. Can't do it. People like Joe Sanfilippo had to give up. If Joe Sanfilippo had to give up, you know why there's only 71 family fishing boats left. And he stuck it out as long as he could. But you know, when you got a day, like I remember running into him one day, we had planned to meet up, it was going to be later in the day, we got up there early to do some other stuff, and there he was at the dock, offloading. At 8:30 in the morning. He's supposed to have already been out there for 2.5 hours. I said, what's up? The rolling closure. That's what often happens, right? NOAA will put out what's called a rolling closure. It might come out at midnight, you know, you get a ping, you get a text, you might be sound asleep. You're getting up at 3 anyway to meet the crew at the dock. Rolling closure. So he had planned, he was all baited up, he was all set. And when you are baited up for a certain trip, that's what you're baited up to do. Meaning that's what you have stocked your boat to do, is to fish a certain place and a certain fish. And Stellwagen Bank, overnight, had been closed. That meant he was out of bait. He had to get rid of his bait. That can cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Let the crew go, thousands of dollars. A 4-day fishing trip canceled. Guy's got a mortgage. Guy has 4 kids, right? Overnight, poof. So this is the kind of stuff that has driven people like Joe Sanfilippo out of fishing. Couldn't do it. He's still a captain. He's captain of the Beauport, which is a cruise vessel out of Gloucester Harbor, you know, tours in the harbor. But by doing what he's doing now, nights, he feels like he has at least made peace with himself that at least somebody, if it's me, great, it's me, is making sure that if the rules and regs ever allow for a new generation of people to get into fishing, men and women, then we'll at least, maybe some people will know how to fish. And I'm talking fundamentals. It's like fishing 101. It's like fishing for dummies. What kind of fish are out there in this area? What do they eat? What do you need for bait? How do you mend a net? Right? How do you bait a hook? How do you service and maintain a large inboard engine? All the fundamentals he's teaching. And I think it's just a great metaphor for struggle, even though it breaks his heart not to be fishing anymore. You know, sometimes struggle, as we all know, only too well sometimes, right, is physical, right? It's, never mind hanging on to a way of life, it's hanging on to life. Louis Escobar is a rarity of double rarity in Rhode Island. First of all, he was a farmer in Rhode Island. That's a rarity. As you may know, Rhode Island is rather small. Most of the farming today in Rhode Island, almost 90% of it, is green farming, meaning they grow grass, literally. The most common farm in Rhode Island today are turf farms. They grow grass. Now, you don't need, surprisingly, a lot of room. You know, 6 acres will set you up in business very nicely of grass. If you are a dairy farmer, which is what Louis Escobar in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, right? Portsmouth is at the top of Quidnick Island, right? That's the main chunk in the middle of Narragansett Bay, the bottom of which is Newport. He was up in Portsmouth, and he did very well. Started this wonderful dairy cooperative with the other 2 dairy farms in Rhode Island, and you know, did very well. Rarity of rarity that he was. About 20 years ago, had a terrible, terrible accident on the farm. His tractor fell over on him. You do not want that to happen. If you live, which he did, you're going to be badly hurt, which he was. It left him a quadriplegic in a wheelchair, but I'll tell you what, you talk about struggle and meeting a challenge. This guy had a wheelchair, well now I think it was 2 or 3 ultimately. You can't really see those tires there, but they're like these studded fat tires. His wife told me he'd been through, at the time that I met Louis first, he'd been through, already been through 3 sets of tires. I think they had rebuilt the engine on this thing, whatever it is, the battery, whatever it was. He was very attached to this wheelchair, so he kept it up. And I'll tell you, you do not know humbling until you have literally trotted, getting out of breath, trying to keep up with the guy in the wheelchair. I was amazed. And he told me that he felt more productive since the accident than he was before, which I think is a great metaphor for resilience, which is another topic we're going to talk about. You know, sometimes the struggle, as journalists know well, is about getting the story out. Right? What's the best way to get the story out? It can be the same struggle for authors to get their story out, right? Jerry Ann Boggess was one of the most inspiring women I've met in my travels around New England. You talk about getting the story out. In this case, it's a story that most people are surprised to even know about, right? You don't think of a long and varied African-American history in the state of New Hampshire. You just don't. Whitest state in America. Whatever. There's just, you know, if you move there like she did, if you emigrate there from Jamaica like she did in the 1970s, you just don't expect to be living amongst a lot of people who look like you. And that was very much the case. But so she was interested in, can I find people going back in history where I live, which was the little town of Milford, New Hampshire. Milford's about 16 miles due west in southern New Hampshire, just west of Nashville. And she wondered, you know, was there anybody else here who looked like me? And indeed there was. And remarkable, it could have been anyone, and she would have lapped that up and researched that. But in this case, it was a remarkable find. It was the story of Harriet E. Wilson. And talk about a great author story. So Harriet E. Wilson was the first black author to have a novel published in North America. First one, in 1859. Amazing story, which I won't go into, I do in the book, but it's just an amazing story. I mean, she begins life literally by being dropped off on the doorstep to a wealthy white family in Milford, New Hampshire, in the 1820-something maybe. And she grows up as an indentured servant to the family. Very bright young woman, loved to read, loved to write, kept a journal, and wrote her book about her experience as an indentured servant in 1859. And Jerry Ann Boggess was so inspired by Harriet E. Wilson's story that she succeeded, you talk about a struggle, when she first brought this story, there were many people in Milford who weren't even familiar with Harriet E. Wilson. Weren't even familiar. This woman who lived there was a daughter of Milford, right? And Jerry Ann Boggess succeeded to the point that she not only was able to share this story so that people in Milford came to know who Harriet E. Wilson was, but in 2006, Jerry Ann Boggess succeeded in having the town of Milford create a memorial to Harriet E. Wilson, which she is leaning against there. Ona Judge, another great story of a black woman in New Hampshire history. She was the personal maidservant of Martha Washington. She lived in the Washington's home, Georgia Martha Washington, and she escaped at one point and decided she wanted to go after her freedom. She was never found, never caught, but also never fully freed. The Washingtons actually kept up a search for her for almost 11 years, including back and forth to New Hampshire. But another part of what Jerry Ann Boggess' legacy is today, which is the co-creator and today executive director of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And if you're ever in New Hampshire and want to see a side of New Hampshire, you won't find it, say, the Old Man of the Mountain or Old Clark's Trading Post. This is an amazing trip through history, because just for the fact that it often surprises us to find something like the remains and a marker signifying where there was a slave auction in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So it wasn't just in Shreveport, it wasn't just in Biloxi. So our first pit stop. Anybody ever been to the Windsor Diner in Windsor, Vermont? One of my very favorites. And what makes the Windsor Diner another rarity, right, is that it is one of those diners that is owned and completely operated by a woman. And in this case, what makes it rarer still is that she does this almost entirely solo. Do you know how hard it is to run a diner on a busy morning all by yourself? Think about that. You got 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 people coming in and out. You got some people all at different stages of their breakfast. They want to order, they want to change their order, they're waiting for their order, they're eating, they want to get the hell out of there and get the check. You've got more people coming in. She's cooking all that and dealing with all that. Amazing, amazing, Teresa Rhodes. But the day that I was there, I got a special treat because I got to meet one of her longtime customers, Billy and I. And Billy, I think he was 83 then, several years ago. Billy had just moved back to Windsor, Vermont to be closer to his older daughter and her family, and he was doing some house painting. How well does he know the diner? Well, even though he had moved away for decades, his mom was a waitress there. So when he was growing up, and he used to come to the diner after school, as mom would set him up on this stool right here, the empty one, right? She'd set him up on that stool, and he'd have his little book bag right here, and he'd put his little tush right here, and he'd do his homework at the counter, and she'd bring him a slice of apple pie. Does that melt your heart? Right? So I said to him though, right? I mean, you must be thinking, why aren't you sitting on your stool? That is like, I told him, I said, that is like your stool. The whole building could come down. They're going to have to bronze that stool and leave it as a statue in the middle of the sidewalk. Why aren't you sitting in your stool? He said, well, you know, I was, 80 when I moved back and came in here for the first time in decades, and I thought to myself, Billy, maybe it's time you graduated to the next school. So when I think of resilience, one of the things I always think about in terms of New England and my travels, but I know you'll all relate to this too, I think of our mill towns. New England, proud mill history, but I think of our mill towns because they are like a metaphor. They are like a brick and mortar metaphor for resilience. What else have they had to be but resilience, right? It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Lawrence or Lowell or Lewiston, Maine, or Biddeford, Maine, or Woonsocket, Rhode Island, right? All of these places once knew great prosperity, right? They once knew great prosperity, as Biddeford did, right? And the whole town was employed at these humming mills. There was great money coming in, right? And then it ended. And then it ended. It ended at different times, but by the mid 20th century, in most of these mill towns, the mills were gone. Oh, the buildings were there, but the prosperity was gone, right? The mill companies first had moved to the American South, and then overseas entirely. Now some of them come back to Mexico. I ain't coming back to none of these towns. And these companies can leave. People can leave in search of more work. The town can't leave, right? So what do you do? What do you do when the jobs and the prosperity have all gone? Well, you reinvent, you reimagine, you reuse, you reemerge, and nowhere is that more the case than Biddeford, Maine. To me, it is kind of the poster child of that reimagining. That thankfully, the turn in the economy that has happened, since the mid-90s or so, has meant what's happened in Biddeford has happened in many other towns and cities around New England, which is that we found new ways to repurpose these mill towns. You look at Lowell, Lawrence today, and they're humming, and good, because they weren't, by the 1970s at all. Most of those old mill buildings, as you well know, have become havens for drugs and crime and arson. Many of these towns and cities would have loved to have torn these places down. Unfortunately, it cost almost as much to tear them down as it would be to refurbish them. So they stayed. And thankfully, to many of these cities and towns, like Haverhill. Haverhill's a perfect example. Haverhill, which was once a centerpiece of the American shoe industry, by the 1970s, the mayor of Haverhill, I remember telling me once, he would have personally, if he had enough dynamite, gone in and blown those places up. He was so sick of kids getting hurt, drugs being dealt, police being hurt, fires breaking out. Today, Haverhill, as you may know, is basically a bedroom community now for Boston. And all those mill stock, all that stock of old mill buildings are now condos and apartments for people who are commuting to Boston. And that was the case, it is now in Biddeford. It certainly wasn't when Alan Casamet was growing up. Any teachers here? Any teachers here? Thank you for your service. Alan Casamet was a math teacher, high school math teacher. And it turns out, no big surprise, he was really, really good with crunching numbers. Now, he wasn't a business guy, but he surrounded himself, when he was mayor for 3 terms, with really good business people. They were able to attract some really smart, some really committed, some really creative investors. But he really shepherded the change in Biddeford, deserves so much credit, you know? He remembers growing up as a young French-Canadian kid in Biddeford in the late 1960s on a Saturday night. All the shops on Main Street being open till 10 o'clock at night. People had been paid the day before, they were flush with cash, everybody was working, the restaurants were humming, it was a great place. By the 1980s, when he was in high school, it was a wasteland downtown. Open till 10 o'clock at night. Half the stores weren't open at all. And that changed. That changed. He had a lot to do with it. It changed all over the city. Things came back that had been abandoned, that had been really set for demolition, like the wonderful City Theater. City Theater is one of those, I've done so many stories in so many states around New England. A lot of towns had them. Many still do. These wonderful, like 19th century opera houses, right? And they were multi-use, right? You might have had in the 19th century, you might have had a lecture. Charles Dickens spoke at the City Theater in Biddeford, Maine. I think in 1841 or something like that. But, there might have been a concert. In many places they get very creative. In Biddeford, they were able to move the floor open so that they could have dances and level the floor, very creative. But when Tim Sample was playing with his rock band in his 20s, the Dubious Brothers, he was remembering that it was right at the end of the City Theater being condemned. In fact, when he was talking with me right there, he was pointing out that along that wall that he was pointing to, all the wallpaper was rolling off and falling down. He said, you couldn't resist, you walk by, it was just fun to pull the wallpaper down. They were really pulling the shades down on the building because a year and a half later it was condemned. And how bad did the indignities get for these once proud City Theater? At one point in the late 1970s, the city busted out the back brick wall in the rear parking lot. They put in a couple of rude garage doors, and the Biddeford DPW was storing road salt inside the City Theater. Not anymore. It's an amazing recovery. Palace Diner, a great story of a diner coming back. I always say, when people say to me, what's your favorite kind of diner? My favorite kind of diner is the diner that is reopened after being closed, okay? That is my favorite. And the Palace has become one of my favorites now. It was reopened, it was closed for 5 years. And Chad Conley and Greg Mitchell, they were foodies out of Portland, Maine. And if you know Portland, Maine, then all you know it's become a real food mecca, right? So if you want to go into the food industry in Portland, if you want to buy into ownership in a successful restaurant, much less start one of your own, you are talking serious 6 figures just to get in the game. Seriously, with a real successful restaurant in Portland. So they realized they were priced out of Portland. So somebody told them about this diner in Biddeford, Palace, that had been closed down for 5 years. And why don't they go take a look at it? They were like, we like diners, but we're not diner guys. And they came down, fell in love. And here's the wonderful thing about the Palace. So I'm generally not fond of diners, and there aren't many of them, because most diners at least stay true to kind of the diner creed. But there are some diners, God bless them, they keep it going, the Rosebud and Davis Square in Somerville. But this would fall into the category that I'm describing, where it's a diner, and it once was, your basic ham and eggs diner, but they're doing like serious foodie stuff at the diner and serving nice, white tablecloth dinner in the evening. Nothing wrong with that. And if the building stays and it looks like the Rosebud like it did in 1930, great, okay? Not my cup of tea, but that's still a success story. At the Palace, you have these 2 guys who were really super foodies, right? They were both really good creative chefs. But they also understood the essence of a diner. Nobody's coming here to check out what we do with Trout and Dean, okay? But what can we do that would be fun and a little bit different? You get your pancakes, you're not going to mistake them for anything but a pancake. It's got maple syrup, it's got butter if you want, But then they do this other little coconut cinnamon glazing thing. Blew me away. Who likes challah here? Who likes challah? The Jewish bread, challah. So as you know what? I had it for French toast this morning. Challah, French toast, because it's kind of sweet anyway, you know? So they do this tuna club with 3 slices of toasted challah. Oh my God. So they're pulling off what is almost the impossible for a diner. Making you hungry? Good, good. So, how many of you have ever skied or like to ski? Yeah, you got some skiing? Okay. So I started skiing as a young boy, and I've skied all my life. And I love to ski. I've been able to share it with my daughters, and I love to ski. I hate the ski industry. It doesn't price me out, I'm thankful. And I feel very fortunate to be able to afford to ski a couple times a year. I was able to, teach my kids how to ski and take them skiing too. But for a vast majority of people in this country, they will never ski. And I don't blame them, because nobody wants to spend thousands of dollars over the course of a season, or hundreds and hundreds of dollars over the course of a single measly day to ski. And that's even without kids, okay? So that's what's wrong for me with skiing. This is the antidote to all of that, okay? You may never ski here. I may or may not ever go back to Northeast Slopes, but it renewed my faith, not just in skiing. It renewed my faith in what we were talking about to begin with, which is my favorite word of all, community. It renewed my faith in community. You may think of Vermont, we all have, different things come to mind, including skiing, maple syrup or fall foliage or what have you. But, a lot of people think justly, accurately, that there is a lot of wealth in Vermont. And in pockets, that is absolutely true. What most people are less aware of, there is some really crushing poverty in Vermont. I mean below the poverty line, poverty in Vermont. Side by side with some of those affluent communities. So East Corinth, Vermont is in the sort of little southwest tip corner of Orange County, Vermont. Orange County, Vermont has virtually nothing in common with any other Orange County in America, especially California or Florida. It is a very, very income insecure place. There are lots of families living in poverty in East Corinth and in that little corner of Orange County. And this is a place that meets people where they are, introduces them to skiing, and makes sure their kids are able to ski. It's an amazing place. It's, you can see, it's a hill. Nothing wrong with that. It's a hill, You're not going to find any slopeside condos. You're not going to find any quad chairlifts. There are no chairlifts. There's a little creaking J-bar, and there is this rope tow. It goes like a bat out of hell. I was just scared because I knew I was gonna try this rope tow to go up the hill, and I knew I hadn't ridden a rope tow. If you've ever ridden a rope tow, there's a certain trick to it, right? Because this rope is like humming along, and at some point you have to let it go through your hand, your gloved hand, and at some point, if you want to go up the hill, you have to grab it, and then it lurches you up the hill. And I thought, well, I don't really want to look like a complete clown, especially on camera. But that was the least of it. I couldn't get over how fast this lift was moving along. And this was after I had digested what made this little place so special, which I buried the lead here, which no self-respecting journalist should ever do. But what makes Northeast Slopes so unique is that it is one of 6 places in America that are non-profit ski areas. That sounds like a non-profit oil company. Like how would that work exactly? They are not for profit. Nobody makes a dime. They are community run and owned, and they are community managed. 100% volunteer. 100% volunteer. Every kid skis. If you can contribute, you contribute. If you can't, you don't. You get skis regardless. If you want to hold on to them for the entire season, you do. And if you won't be able to afford skis next year, you keep them. They're all donated from ski shops all over Vermont. It's a great story. It's a great story. So I was checking out this lift, and it was Wade Pearson's turn during this period of time that I visited. It was Wade Pearson's turn to be chief cook and bottle washer at Northeast Slopes, right? So it was his turn to be chairman of the board and kind of, in charge of everything, including the lifts. And so I asked him, I said, how are you running this lift? What is this running off of? Because I'm afraid to even touch that rope. He said, oh, let me show you. He could not wait to show off what was running this lift. Oh, right there when he was saying it, he was like, oh, this thing purrs. Oh, it purrs. And he swore to me that this 73 Dodge Dart with a slant 6, he swore to me, not that this has had tires on it for 40 years, but he swore to me, he said, I'll tell you right now, give me a set of tires, yank this thing down off the blocks, and I'll have this out on 89 going 70 miles an hour. Amazing. So how much money did I spend? So I can tell you that this year we are likely to see the $200 a day lift ticket premiere in New England. Yep. It's already been out west at Vail last year. Yep. So how much did I spend? Not 20 bucks. I spent $10, $10.50 for a lift ticket, and another $6 for a delicious cheeseburger in their little standing room only hut, which is about a third the size of this whole room. And I tell you what is that, $16.50? I'm not sure that would buy you a bottle of water at Vail. I'm not sure. Wow. Certainly not chilled. So it renewed my faith. So, when I think about resilience, I think that humor is a key part of resilience. I think it's true for individuals, I think it's true for communities, to be able to not take ourselves too seriously, to be able to laugh and smile even in the face of challenge and adversity and struggle. It's like the old Mainerisms, right? Like the couple's vacationing in Maine somewhere and it's rained for 5 days and they say to the old Mainer, my goodness, you think it'll ever stop raining? Always has. Rebecca Rule is that kind of person. Becky Rule lives in Northwood, New Hampshire, which is that little rut form that goes between like Lee and Epsom, and Antique Alley. It's where Antique Alley is. And Becky Rule is one of the funniest women I've ever met, and she always makes me laugh. I remember once we were having a discussion about when do you actually become a native in an old New England town? Because I have met New Englanders, like a 93-year-old in Waldoboro, Maine once. This one blew me away. Guy was 97. I said, I assume you're a native here. He said, no, sir. No, sir. He had moved, his family had moved to Waldoboro, Maine when he was 6 months old. Do you think he can be a native now? Probably could, according to Becky's law. So Becky stipulates that you become a native in your town when the last person who knows when you moved there dies. Makes sense, right? So she's written a lot of wonderful books that often have a New England theme. I loved her last book, was called Heading for the Rhubarb. Any horse people here? Or husk people, as Becky says? So apparently, how would I have known this? I don't know horses. But rhubarb, okay, is apparently very bad for horses. It won't kill them, but it's no good for them, right? So if your horse was heading to the rhubarb, you wanted to make sure you got that horse back, okay? But over time, it became like an expression of anybody heading for trouble was heading to the rhubarb. So as she puts it, you might have two old friends sitting on the porch of the general store and they're watching their other friend Ed walking down the street with a woman and who apparently he's fixing to marry, and one of the friends turns to the other and says, I'll tell you right now, he's heading for the rhubarb with that one. So I'll test you. Here, see if you can figure this one out. She told me this one, I read it on the printed page, she said it, I still couldn't get it. Adelduphia. It's not a place. It's not outside Philadelphia. It's Adelduphia. And this is how she explains it. She says, I'll run over to Barrington in Caleb's General Store, and I'll pick up a few things, and I'll bring my little basket up to the counter, and Tina will say, all right, hon, Adelduphia. Right? resilience, I have to include this because it was one of the sweetest, most wonderful afternoons of my entire life. It really was. You know, it takes resilience to conceive of, build, create, open, and maintain the Maine Country Music Hall of Fame. Okay? Where it is not about being boots, but cowboy boots. And I'll tell you what, Slim Andrews is one of the sweetest human beings I've ever met in my whole life. He himself is in the Maine Country Music Hall of Fame. If you're wondering why there is a very vibrant country music scene in Maine, but the thing is, it goes back. It's not Garth Brooks. It goes back. It goes back like 70 years, okay? And the whole reason for it is the greatest, weirdest quirk of geography. So there was a radio station in Wheeling, West Virginia, nowhere near Maine, okay? And you got it, and in the late 1940s, they had bought a brand new transmitter and antenna. And the thing arrives on 4 flatbed trucks, and it's an 8-story antenna and a transmitter that would be befitting like a big city radio station. So it was clearly a screw up in the order. Somehow it ended up staying in Wheeling. And this little station in Wheeling, West Virginia, which all night long played country music, was reaching stations in Quebec City. Wow. Okay? Including all of Maine. So for people like Slim Andrews growing up, that's what he would listen to at night, because it's all he was getting. But it spawned an entire generation plus of country music lovers, and he's the real deal. He's written like 67 country music songs. I asked him, where do you get Slim Andrews? Were you born Slim Andrews? He said, no, not at all. I was born Leonard Huntington. I said, well, where'd you get Slim Andrews? He said, well, I just figured it might work better for me, and I'm not the first. He said, I'm sure you've heard of Harold Lloyd Jenkins. I said, I've never heard of Harold Lloyd Jenkins. He said, sure you have. You've heard of Conway Twitty. Right? So he got Slim Andrews, and he showed me around that day. And you know what was sweet? It was just about this time of year. Right? So there's a lot of fall leaf peeping tour buses all around. Not really there. But he kept saying, from the very start of his little tour, he kept saying, I just want to remind you, happy to spend all day with you, but I have to remind you that if people show up and crowds begin to gather, I will have to break off. They did gather. I got him the entire time we were there. But I love the idea that he's invested in this museum. And you know, when I was putting the book together, I suddenly felt I wanted to get back in touch with him. And I called, and it turns out that he had passed away 2 months ago. But I am so glad I got to Mechanic Falls, Maine when I did. So you know, a story of diner resilience is in Brunswick, Maine. Any of you ever been to the Brunswick Diner? Brunswick Diner, another diner run by a woman for a long time, Jane Davis, ran it for over 35 years. Her daughter Cassidy, grew up in the diner. Literally, Cassidy, like our friend Billy Nye, Cassidy would go with her mom, who was a single mom. Mom had to open up the diner at, before daylight, and Cassidy would trudge over to the diner with her, sit at the counter, finish her homework, eat her breakfast. School bus would stop at the diner, she'd get on and go to school. And Jane made it through COVID, the diner made it through COVID, but then she realized, I just can't. I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. And so she asked her daughter if she would take a week off from her job in Portland and come and help her kind of wind things down. And so Cassidy did, and while she was there that week, she just fell in love with this place all over again. And she just felt like, I can't see closing this. She never went back to Portland. Cassidy is now the owner of her mom's diner, and I just think it's such a wonderful, wonderful story. So let's finish now in the last few minutes on a real upbeat, not that that's not an upbeat note, but the whole world of triumph in New England. The whole world of triumph in New England. You may never have heard of James Weldon Johnson. His life may have ended tragically, but it was triumphant in so many ways. James Weldon Johnson wore so many hats, and the hats that he wore as a black man in America in the 1920s were almost each one a first, blazing a trail. right? He was the first lawyer to pass the bar exam, black, in Florida. He was the first black professor at NYU. He became the first executive director of the NAACP. He was a prolific author and poet. And he was a diplomat. He did several diplomatic missions for President Teddy Roosevelt in Latin America. He co-wrote with his younger brother, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which, if that sounds at all familiar, that has begun to gain some popularity as the black national anthem. It is actually not an anthem, it is a hymn, as Johnson was always very quick to point out, but it was played before the Super Bowl this past year. And he, you can imagine, was a pretty busy guy, and his doctor felt in the 1920s that he needed to do something about his stress level, and he encouraged him to find a place for him and his wife, Grace Nail Johnson, to find a place outside of New York, maybe you can get away to, you know. So they did. They found a lovely little place in the Berkshires called 5 Acres, because it sat on 5 little acres. It was a beautiful little former dairy barn that had been made into a home, and he and Grace Nail, they bought it, and they loved it, and he wanted to create a writing cabin on the property, because he was, as I said, he spent most of his downtime writing. There was a little brook so that's the front of the house. There was a little brook that meandered behind the house. And the brook had an embankment on the other side, a little bit steep, and it went up a little hill and into very, very dense woods. And it was in those woods that he had a little writing cabin. You can see him posing outside the writing cabin in the mid-1920s. And he did his writing in there, and it was wonderful. Unfortunately, he died in a car accident in the 1930s in Maine. Grace, his wife, never returned to Great Barrington. And the house, fortunately, did have a couple of other owners over the decades, so the house remained. The writing cabin, it was pretty much accepted, had kind of just fallen to the woods and the weather and almost 100 years of New England winters. And now fast forward almost 100 years. And this is where it gets almost eerie. So fast forward almost 100 years, and another young black couple in New York is looking for a place to escape to outside of New York. Now, what makes it interesting is that the woman part of this couple has recently become the executor of the James Weldon Johnson literary estate. So she knows his story. And they're blown away when it turns out they can buy his former home, which they do. And they ask the realtor, now, what about the writing cabin? And he says, I'm so sorry, but the writing cabin, I do not think you will find. I mean, you're welcome to go comb through the woods out back and see if you can find any scraps. I mean, I don't know anybody personally who's been back there for 30 years, but you're welcome to try. They did not give up on the notion that they had seen some reference to the writing cabin in the 1950s, and they used that to bolster their confidence, and Jill and Rufus Jones found that writing cabin, still intact, needing a roof, and they also decided this thing seemed to have changed the trajectory of their lives. And so they decided to really now base their efforts around this figure in history. The James Weldon Johnson Foundation was formed. It's going to be an educational program. They have educational programs for kids, writers in residence, artists in residence at the cabin. I was out there, right there, about a month ago. The cabin has been completely restored. The exterior, all weatherized, brand new roof. They're now working on the interior. Educational groups, students are already coming to the cabin. Their support has grown exponentially. The NFL is now a prime sponsor of the James Weldon Johnson Foundation, and it is a triumph, and it is truly a story of furthering a legacy at 5 acres. Now, sometimes, before you triumph at the top of a mountain, let's say, you have to reach rock bottom. And if what has brought you to rock bottom is drug abuse, you have a 50-50 shot of whether you'll be getting back up at all. And Larson Ojula can tick off for you, 6, 7 friends of his, kids he knew growing up, kids he knew from school, all dead to the scourge of drugs. By 12 years old, he was abusing fentanyl, then heroin, and he knew he was going nowhere good. But he was one of the lucky ones. He really is one of the lucky ones, which he completely acknowledges. He reached a point where he wanted to stop doing what he was doing. And his family helped. A mentor was key. This mentor was himself a hiker. Larson, as a young kid, loved to hike Mount Monadnock. He grew up in Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, which is right next door to Jaffrey. Mount Monadnock straddles Jaffrey and Fitzwilliam, and he hiked Monadnock all the time as a kid. But by the time he was 20 years old, he couldn't get up a flight of stairs. So he checked himself into recovery, and he met this wonderful mentor who was himself an extreme hiker, meaning he's one of these people who they try to hike a mountaintop as fast as you can. For most of us, it's just a nice, lovely walk, right? However long it takes. Now, these are people who literally will run, if they can, up and down a mountain. But he, for some reason, he took that as his model for recovery. It helps to have that. And that was his model for recovery. He, damn it, was going to hike up Mount Monadnock as fast as he could. And he did. And he did. Today, Larson has a wonderful family of his own. He's got a little concrete company in Fitzwilliam, a lovely wife. He's got 2 young sons that hike all over America. And in April 2021, Larson Ojula set a new world record for the number of summits up and down Mount Monadnock in 24 hours, 17 summits in 24 hours. And just to put a point on it, a year later, in 2018, 18 summits in 24 hours. And you know, it's funny, he did that over a Saturday and a Saturday night, and he finished on Sunday morning at one point. And I heard he was doing it, he was doing it, so I texted him that morning, and I texted him and said, "Congratulations, my friend, you did it. You did it." And he texted back, and he said, "Thanks, Dad." He said, "Next time, you do it with me." And I think I set a world record for number of laughing emojis on one text. So lastly, my favorite story. Saved it for last. And one of my favorite people. Steve Brosnahan is saintly. I don't say that loosely, but he is one of those people. I had the incredible opportunity years and years ago to meet Elie Wiesel. If you know who Elie Wiesel is, he was a Holocaust survivor. His entire family was wiped out. He himself was in Buchenwald and was freed by the Allies, and he spent the rest of his life. He taught at BU for a while, which is when I met him, and he spent the rest of his life really talking about not just the Holocaust, but in the ways in which we as humanity, right, cannot fail to recognize when hate is morphing into something worse than hate, like annihilation, extermination, okay? That was Elie Wiesel, and there was always, it's not just my opinion, there's always something people said, there's something, an aura about Elie Wiesel. I feel that way about Steve Brosnahan. Now, Steve Brosnahan works at Hasbro Children's Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. Hasbro Children's is a hospital almost entirely is helping kids with cancer. And Steve likes to joke that while he's the lowest paid member of the medical staff, he is the most popular because he's not a doctor, he's a cartoonist. And so he says, "I don't make nearly as much, but when I come to these kids' door, they're actually happy to see me. They know they're not going to be pricked and prodded. They know they're not going to be scheduling a test. And he has a great time. He makes all of his kids feel like they're his best friend. And there was a young guy who he had become very friendly with, a young boy, years ago. This would have been now maybe 12, 13 years ago. And this young kid, fortunately, was about to be released from the hospital. And so Steve wanted to do something nice for him. He wanted to give him a special goodbye. And so he realized as he looked out the kid's window that the kid's window faced the front of the hospital, and Steve rides his bike to and from work. And so he said he knew he'd be rolling his bike out the front door later, and he said, "I want you to look outside, right down there, at 8:30, you're going to have a little surprise." And sure enough, at 8:30, Steve wheeled his bike out, he looked up at the kid's room, and he flashed his high-powered bike, his flashlight, and he flashed it on and off, on and off, on and off, waved, and turn, and he realized the lights in the room were flashing on and off. The kid instantly, intuitively responded by flashing his light to say goodbye and return. And Steve says it was the biggest aha moment of his life, because he realized, he said, if I can do that then for him, I can do it for all these kids. The whole city maybe could do it. And people are like, what are you smoking, Steve? But he had vision, and he ran with it. Because his idea was, never mind me standing out in front of the hospital with a measly flashlight. There's a lot of lights in this city, a lot of big buildings. What if we could get everybody to flash their lights? And that was his ask. That was his ask. Every night, 8:30, 1 minute. How about you, Brown University? How about you, Providence College? How about you, Providence River Tugboat Company? How about all the bars and the taverns and the restaurants and the cafes and the coffee shops? How about all the residences that he could reach? How about the police department, the fire department? It took a while. It didn't happen overnight. But it's happened. It's happened as such now that goodnight lights as a phenomenon, well, if Steve had patented this, he'd be making a lot of money now consulting with cities all around the country, but he doesn't. He won't take a dime for it. He's more than happy to consult with cities on how it's done. How is it done? That's exactly how it's done. 1 minute, every night, the magic minute. At 8:30 in Providence, Rhode Island, at 8:30 in Providence, Rhode Island, all the children at Hasbro Children's who are able come up to the solarium on the top floor where they're facing out at the city. They all have their own little flashlights to return the favor. And the lights come on. And the lights come on, police departments. I'm saying if you are standing on the top of Hasbro Children and you look out, it's an astonishing thing to see. It's an astonishing thing to see. So I wanted to do a story about it. I had been for years, and I finally was ready to do it, and I got in touch with Steve, and I said, can you connect us with a young patient who loves goodnight lights? He said, I can definitely do that. I got just the person. And boy, was she just the person. Abby Waldron. Abby? When I met Abby, she was 10. She was 2 years younger than my youngest daughter. And she was in Hasbro Children's for treatment of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Prognosis was not clear. It's terrible. It's terrible. And, obviously, parents are in the room, and doctors, and nurses, and we were there, and the one person who laughed the entire afternoon, the one person who was cracking us up with corny jokes, was the patient. Abby Waldron she was undergoing chemo. She'd lost her hair, it had been down to her waist. But she loved goodnight lights. And she said, you gotta stay for goodnight lights. I said, of course we're gonna stay for goodnight lights. You can't get rid of me for that thing. And we stayed and we watched it with her. And that night there had been a special surprise because the East Providence Police and Fire Department had connected with 4 other local communities. They had brought in some major ladder apparatus. So they had lights that were like slowly moving. The kids were like, oh my God. And Abby was like, so you can see the logo there. This was from that show we did. And she said, oh my, I said, what do you think of this tonight? She said, it's like the grand finale. It was so wonderful. And that piece about Goodnight Lights, which is entirely a credit to Steve Brosnahan and what he created, won an Emmy Award a year later. And that was on a Saturday night in May 2019. And the next morning, I called Steve, and I had him get in touch with Abby Waldron's family. And I said, can you meet me? Can you all meet me at the hospital, the front of the hospital, Monday morning at 10 o'clock? And we did. They got the award that was really theirs to have. And I shared that with them. Abby, cancer-free now. Cancer-free and laughing as always. So lastly, just to button it off, my favorite diner. My favorite story, my favorite diner. Anybody ever been to the Boulevard in Worcester? You have. Oh, it's so great. The Boulevard is basically, it's like that old saying. It's like, if you look up diner in a dictionary, this is the picture you should see, right? The Boulevard is an authentic Worcester Dining Car Company, 736. That is a special thing. That's a special for a dining to be a Worcester Dining Car Company. That was the first company ever in Worcester, the first company anywhere that was mass producing diners to be used as diners, not just train cars that have been shunted off, right? So it is number 736, and diners from the Worcester Dining Car, they're sought after today. They're all over New England, all over the country. You can find a Worcester Dining Car in Palm Springs, California, believe it or not. The Windsor Diner in Windsor, Vermont is Worcester Dining Car. But what I love about this one is that the Boulevard traveled the shortest distance. So they're all over the country. This traveled the shortest distance of any Worcester Dining Car from assembly line to final location. 1/8 of a mile on Shrewsbury Street, right? And the other thing I love about it, it's the only diner I have ever seen whose sign simply says what it is. And with that, thank you.